Hey guys, welcome back to the Another Excuse podcast, where we chat to founders, creators, and self-starters about how they started and where they are now. Today's guest is Jeremy Bentham. He recently retired as Vice President of Global Business Environment and Shell Scenarios leader. At Shell, he spent 40 years there and had an impressive career, but he hasn't really slowed down. He's the co-chair of Scenarios and a senior advisor at World Energy Council. He's a senior fellow at Mission Possible Partnership. He's a President's Council member at Pathfinder International. He's a senior advisor at Boston Consulting Group. He's a contributor/author at illuminem. He's a board member of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and a senior advisor at Nordic West Office. In the episode, we discuss things like scenario thinking, strategic character, the Meyers Briggs test and how it helps you communicate better with your team, creating framework to take action, energy transitions, how we can make an impact, and much, much more. There's so much value packed into this episode. I'm sure you'll learn something. I really hope you do. Enjoy the show. Thank you for joining me today, Jeremy. You've had a very impressive career, and I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot from this conversation. To start us off, I wanted to ask about you being known as Mr. Scenarios, and how did this title come about?
Oh, well, thank you. It's really lovely to talk with you. Mr. Scenarios came about because I had the privilege of leading the team that developed Shell Scenarios within Shell for 16 years. And with this approach to strategy setting that Shell has developed over 50 years, it's kind of become known as a bit of a brand of the Shell Scenarios. And so, even though I hopefully was involved in more things than scenarios, I became known as Mr. Scenarios. I mean, to tell the truth, I wished it was a little bit broader and it was Mr. Scenario Thinking or something like Mr. Wiser Decisions using Scenario Thinking. But that's not really a very good soundbite, is it? So Mr. Scenarios will have to do for the moment.
That makes sense. Yes, they don't roll off the tongue as easily as Mr. Scenarios, but that does provide some context. So how would you describe scenario thinking mindset, and why is it important?
It's important because it's actually a pretty fundamental aspect of reality, of being able to wrestle with the future. There are many strong currents that are shaping the world now, hence shaping how the world will be in the future. And with every strong current, always generates countercurrents. And in advance, from the outset, you can't tell which is going to be the strongest. So there are inevitably various plausible outcomes which can be quite different. And trying to ignore that is basically being lazy in grappling with the future. And so it's a fundamental aspect of being wise in thinking about the future and thinking about how the choices you make now may play out and have consequences in future.
Interesting. And so throughout your career, you had to manage many successful teams. How would you describe your management style?
Hmm. Well, I hope others would describe me as collaborative and participative, and perhaps a way of thinking about it is as a theatre director, as an orchestrator. There's lots of different elements that need to come together, and you need to be part of a process with other people in which you're encouraging the best contributions from others, but within a context where you are collectively trying to achieve something. And so I like that theatre directing analogy for the style that I hope that I was able to employ in the various different roles I was privileged to have.
And would you look at yourself as a mentor?
Again, that would be a nice thing. I do really enjoy coaching others and mentoring others in their lives, and so I think that's an aspect of my character, and perhaps it goes beyond. I hope it goes beyond just the sense that I've got some good ideas I'd like to share, and I'd like you to have them and run with them. There's an element of that I recognize, but there's actually a strong element that I care about other people and the world, and it gives me a kick to see people flourishing. And then if I can be part of that, I will seek to be part of that. To be a coach that is helpful to other people.
Yes. And did you have any mentors throughout your career? And if so, what did you look for in a mentor and how did they affect your career?
Um, to tell the truth, and this isn't a very good message for other people. Uh, I didn't explicitly seek mentors. I think that idea of seeking mentors came into the business vocabulary almost later on in my career. But I look back at the people who made a difference and who I kind of followed, and perhaps I put that in that light. So, for example, I got really one of the biggest things that helped me on my way from my, relatively humble origins uh, through a man called Neil Tanner, who was an Australian, who was a professor, a fellow at Oxford University. And he noticed that most of the people at Oxford University that he saw were from a very similar background, from private schools in the south of England, that he felt that there had to be more talent around the country. And so he went out looking for um, working class talent who wouldn't otherwise think of going to a place like Oxford. And that became known as the Tanner Scheme. And I was picked up within that Tanner Scheme and given a kind of education and a kind of introduction to new possibilities that I wouldn't otherwise have had. And I've actually remained in touch with the college and continue to try and help support that ethos for the college. I think if you look later, my first boss in Shell, Anthony Barber, yeah, had a big influence because he was so welcoming, and he invested a lot of time in helping make sure that myself and we were living in the Netherlands, and so I was a new wife, child on the way, that we were settled and we were all right. He cared, and he also encouraged me in different directions. I was doing research at the time. He encouraged that, but encouraged me to reach out with my ideas and be supportive of that. And so I felt like I had a completely free hand in research and was actually able to make contributions in that. So that was a valuable lesson. Um, Later, there was a very wild and interesting character called Yap Lamehouse. Uh, he'd been an Olympic hockey player, which is a big thing in the Netherlands. That so he had that kind of background, but he was a very broad thinker and stimulator, and he actually introduced me into systems thinking and scenario thinking, and again encouraged me to run with things that I was interested in. And then perhaps again, just doing a little theatre analogy as well. Somebody else who came to mind as I'm just thinking now is uh, I did bits of theatre throughout my life, and Roberta Enskede was um, um, a former actress who coached acting, and I actually learnt a lot from her around issues such as authenticity, but also being able to recognize that there are many different types of power and power dynamics in all interpersonal situations. And even though I'm not necessarily the greatest reader of that myself, that awareness, that alertness was kind of helpful as well. So, there I've given you four people that spring to mind that have influenced the way that I think and the way that I interact with other people.
Yes, and you've touched on the theatre a few times, and I'd like to unpack that a bit more. How could you explain your experiences in the theatre and how possibly that impacted you later on in your career?
Oh, certainly. For various reasons, I effectively um, left home at age 15. And I basically um, lived amongst a group of people who were involved in theatre. They were largely mature students doing teacher training in theatrical studies, but there was a theatre group that was there, and I did a little bit of sofa surfing and living in the bar of the theatre and pretending I was older than I actually was. And I got involved in all kinds of things there. I got involved in acting and then set building and lighting and gradually having a an education, I guess, in theatre. And later on in my life, as a young person in in business life, I continued to be involved in theatre. It turned out to be one of the things my wife and I had in common was our interest in theatre. So got involved in theatre groups, and eventually I was invited to direct plays as well as being in plays, and that was a really important part of my education without me realizing it at the time, because I had to take responsibility. I had to lead something. I had to take something and draw out the spine of meaning from it and think about how you work with, how you project that spine of meaning. But even more so, you have around you, however many people are involved from all the different facets, on stage, backstage, lighting, set design, everything. And you have to work with people and um, have a development of not only a common goal, but a common enthusiasm for that goal, particularly if you're in um, a semi-professional or amateur setting, as I tended to be. People were doing things because they wanted to do them. They wanted to be involved in them. And so you're encouraging all these things to happen and come together. But you have a tight deadline. The curtain is going to go up then. You have to bring it all together then. And so that combination of creativity, that was still an important part of this, uh, bringing folks together around common goals and having all the practicalities of budgets and deadlines. When I looked back on it 10 years later, I can see that I actually learned an awful lot from that experience.
Yeah, I'm sure many people overlook those kind of experiences in the moment for how valuable they can be. And what advice would you give someone wanting to get more leadership experience like that?
It's quite interesting you asked that, because very often it happened to me that there would be younger people in whatever department or division that I was running who would approach me because they were coming to take their first leadership type of role, an assignment in that, and they'd ask me, well, what would you advise? I've done these courses, and I'm prepared in that way. So that's great. But I always said, what I found was the value of getting somebody to give you the responsibility to direct a play with amateurs, because you have no hold over them in terms of salary or the ability to promote them or anything like that. They have to do what they're doing because they really believe in it and they really want to do it. And I said, okay, theatre is my thing. It may not be your thing, but there's something similar in getting involved and taking a position of responsibility in your local amateur football team or your local youth hockey team. That there are various things. There will be something that really interests you naturally, but in which you can take on a position of responsibility and really grapple with the combination of the technical, the creative, and the interpersonal side of that. So that was the kind of advice I would give to young folks asking me that question.
That's great advice. It's pretty obvious and we know it, but we tend not to do it, is by learning by doing, and you learn a lot more by doing. And so what characteristics would you look for in an individual that signaled to you that they had potential?
There is something about energy and enthusiasm that encourages, because uh, it, it, if somebody's going to be able to get something done, that energy and enthusiasm is important. I believe curiosity is very, very important, because I do believe that you're not trying to just recreate what has been before you. You're trying to build on that, and the curiosity to understand and build on that, to have persistence, and to have humility, to recognize that it may feel like you're the center of the universe, but actually you're not. And to not only involve others, but to listen to others and to learn from others. The factors in what I've called at times strategic character, and that term strategic character um, came for me from listening to um, a General Norman Schwarzkopf, who led the Gulf military activities back in the beginning of the 90s, and they were considered a success. And he was then asked, "Okay, how do you get success?" And he said something like, well, to have success, you need to have two things. You need to have good strategy and you need to have good character. And if you can only have one, have good character. And I listened to that and I thought, yes, but you can have both. You can have strategic character. So I began then to think about what are the factors behind what I refer to as strategic character.
And what makes up strategic character?
Ah, um, it's not one thing. It's a combination of things. People bring different strengths to different aspects to it. But I use an acronym, or a phrase rather, to help me remember the different factors. So my phrase is, so heroes can practice purpose. I can remember that. Uh, but the S from the so stands for um, scenario and systems thinking. It's this recognition of this fundamental reality that different outcomes are possible, and that there's a bigger picture of factors in systems that are influencing that. So that's one aspect of it. That's a bit of a technical aspect to it, but it's important. Not everybody likes to think out of the the constraints of their narrow current horizons and their narrow time horizons. But this is something that's important there. So the H for heroes is indeed humility. I mentioned humility, and that's that recognition that not only are different perspectives valuable, they're important uh, because you need other people to be involved in whatever you're trying to do, but also what you're trying to do is going to affect other people. And so having that uh, humility that says, um, there is more than I can see, um, and there is more than just myself in the world, is, I think, an important aspect to it. So heroes can, the sea, there's kind of a lot of things in the sea. I've mentioned curiosity. I think that's really important. I think at times you do need courage. And I think there's also the ability to develop confidence in the things that you believe in, creativity, and then finally, collaboration. Again, nothing can be achieved in isolation. A lot can be achieved with others. And so having that collaborative attitude, I think, is part of the strategic character. And um, the P for practice really refers to patience and persistence. I mentioned persistence before, and nothing happens overnight. A lot can happen in a couple of years if you're patient and persevere, if you keep at it. And that brings me to the last P of purpose, which stands for purpose. That if you have a sense of purpose, this greater thing that you're looking to contribute to, that actually fuels the patience and the persistence. Because otherwise you get discouraged, and the ability to come back to say, no, this is noble, this is important, is valuable in keeping that patience and persistence. So heroes can practice purpose, helps me remember those factors, and maybe it'll help others remember the factors as well.
Yes, I'm sure it'll help me too. So heroes can practice purpose. It's pretty simple to remember, and it's that. Thank you for explaining strategic character. That makes perfect sense. And you've spoken about having a legacy mentality before. What exactly is a legacy mentality?
Yeah. Again, it's a little bit about having that broader perspective, but this time along the time dimension, both looking forward and looking back. I think there are two aspects to it. When you're involved in something now, there can be so many things that are affecting you that you're trying to do. What are the priorities? There's lots and lots. People are generally busy people. And so I encourage people and encourage myself to think forward 10 years and just look back and say, what would I like to remember from this time in what I'm doing now? What would I like to uh, have had an impact? What's important when I look back from 10 years time? So that's kind of going forward and looking back, and then and kind of going in the other direction. When you have that sense, whenever you're kind of doing something, very often you're part of a movement, part of something happening. Uh, you're going to go off, and if you're in a job, you're going to be reassigned or go to another job, and a lot of what you've been doing won't necessarily go forward. So part of the legacy mentality is then saying, well, of the things that I'm doing, what really needs to go forward? And then um, institutionalizing that so that it has a life beyond you and your perhaps short time involved in that activity as well. So that's that kind of two aspects of what I refer to as legacy mentality.
Great. Thank you for explaining that. And I also know that you've touched on the Myers Briggs indicator in the past. Could you explain what this is and how this has influenced the way you operate in business, and whether that be understanding others or yourself better?
Thank you. Yes, I was introduced to the Myers Briggs framework when I was a student at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And I think it originated from um, researchers there, a mother and daughter, Myers and Briggs, who uh, developed a framework with four dimensions to it for kind of helping to describe, the way that people's minds, their brains seem to be wired. And I think pretty well everybody who's been to MIT has been through the framework, and it grew. And it's been shown to have some empirical value to it, that things are persistent there. People have been followed through their careers. There's plenty of criticisms for it, but it seems to have um, uh, a degree of empirical validity that is helpful, because with those kind of four dimensions, you actually get 16 different personality types. It doesn't describe the whole person, but ways of thinking, ways of accessing information, or um, using that information, or expressing that learning. And uh, when you apply that framework within groups, what you find is that people can be quite different. And so it really does help illuminate the differences between people. That can help with understanding, but it can also help with that humility that we all tend to think that we're pretty normal and that everybody else is a little bit of a variation on that. But actually, people can be quite different. And it gives you insight into that, so you appreciate cognitive diversity as well as the more obvious aspects of diversity. But also, it can be very helpful for personal insights as well. So there's one dimension between um, introversion and extroversion, and um, I'm actually a relatively strong introvert. I like to think. I like to be in my head. I like to reflect.
So am I.
And others are quite strong extroverts. They actually think by speaking and getting reactions to that. And I had a colleague, a great colleague, who's unfortunately passed away relatively recently, uh, who was a strong extrovert, and we were having difficulty fitting together because he'd ask me a question, and I would go into reflective mode, thinking about it for a second. He thought I hadn't understood the question because he was expecting an immediate answer, so he'd ask me the question again, but in a different way. And now I'm getting confused, and so it went on. And we actually, when we went and we were coached on this framework together, we learnt about this, and we actually learnt the way of working together. He was in another country to what I was based in at the time. So what we would do is uh, he would telephone me, uh, and we'd have his kind of side of the conversation. I then sit down, think about it. I'd actually write a response and email him a response, and he'd take that, and if necessary, then we would have another conversation to get there. But we actually learned an effective way of working together, which we wouldn't have learned if it hadn't been illuminated by this framework. Do you want another example?
Please, yeah, I find this so fascinating because I'm also I think my score is INJF. I can't remember, or FJ. I can't remember
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
it FJ?
Yeah.
Yes, that's mine, and I found it very interesting, and it is so helpful in particularly a work environment, learning how to communicate with others. So please go on.
Yeah. Oh, the other one is uh, uh, the difference between my wife and I.
Yes.
So I am an INTP, and I won't go into explaining all that. Uh,
Well, you
but
can if you'd like. I'm sure it is very interesting.
I'm introverted in the sense that I get my energy by thinking for myself, reflecting, being apart from people. I like being with people, but that tires me. I have to retreat. Um, I'm an N, which means I think more architecturally rather than the individual bricks to begin with. Even though the bricks are important for the architecture, I approach it from the architecture side. I'm a T, so that means logic is the way that I arrange my thoughts. Whereas an F, like yourself, actually sees the individual. It's an F for feeling first, and the impact on individuals. And then I'm a P, which means I'm an option generator, an idea generator, rather than a J, which is judging, which is bringing that to a focus, to a decision. Now, clearly, you have to do all those things if you're going to be effective as a person in an organization or as a leader. So all those aspects are, but these are kind of preferences. These are defaults. And so I'm an INTP and my wife's an INFP, and that sounds quite close, but actually it means that different strengths come out in different ways. So there'll be many, many situations when something is going on and my wife is looking at me and saying, I just cannot believe you did that or you said that. Or I do it to her the other way around. And it's not that I don't feel, but I actually have to think my way into understanding situations, and then the compassion and the feeling comes. And it's not that my wife is illogical, although sometimes I claim that, but don't say that. But no, it's that what strikes her first is the human situation. And so, for example, if we go into a group of people, my wife reads that group much more quickly than I do. I have to kind of almost click into remembering to try to read the group, whereas naturally my wife does that. So it's, we can be quite different, which at its best can be really complementary. At its worst means that we can be very frustrated with each other.
I'm sure. I think I need to do the test with my girlfriend so we can sort of maybe understand each other a bit better and learn how we work well together and how we don't. Um, you spent 40 years at Shell. That's an amazing accomplishment and particularly rare for generations entering the workforce today. What would you say kept you at Shell, and how did you find ways to continuously grow and develop?
um, well, I didn't plan from the beginning to have 40 years in the company. In fact, I I came into the company because what I was working on in research, there was a technical problem which meant it would be a couple of years before this would be the linear accelerator that my experiment was on would be repaired, and so I could either hang around doing studenty things for a couple of years, but I was newly married. I had a child on the way. It seemed better to kind of reach out and at least make some money and then come back. So I looked around for what looked kind of interesting, kind of big scale, and the energy world looked really interesting, an international dimension. I was already somebody who originated in England, living in California. I'd already kind of stepped beyond the borders, and so I applied to a few different companies, but Shell was the one that seemed the most interesting, and they were interested in me joining them. So I joined, and then um, I just found it. very, very interesting. I was doing interesting things with different types of people. And uh, there was this aspect of, typically you moved into a new role every 3 years or so. And so, there was, uh, and in an organization that large, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of different kinds of things you could do. And so, um, you know, I followed that. There was just, it became more interesting than the idea of going back into academia. I guess there was an aspect that I got used to being paid and having a salary. I think that may have played a role, but it didn't play a strong role. It played a role, but the real thing was um, I, I started enjoying what I was doing, and I have to say, and I've got to be honest to the company. Whilst at times, I've been very disappointed with the company in my career. 40 years, I can probably look back and say, there were only probably a couple of years that I didn't enjoy myself in that time, and that when I compare with other folks that I've chatted with, that's a pretty good batting average.
Yes, that definitely is an amazing batting average. And would you say you took the normal trajectory of a Shell employee, or did you have to take risks to have the progression that you did? How do you manage risk and know when to take them?
Um, at the time, there were, I think, more fixed kind of career paths for graduates in the company. Now, of course, the way of developing people has evolved, and there have been swings and roundabouts and pendulums swinging one way than the other over time. But at the time, there was a fairly um, steady way, and I joined as a research and then a research engineer, and there was a pathway there. Uh, but uh, I was became more and more interested in the world, not just the commercial world, but if you like, the world of the macro economy, the world of strategy, put it that way. And so, whilst my next role could well have been um, planned as going into a technical role in operations, which would have been interesting. Some people could really enjoy that. It didn't feel like me. And so I kind of let it be known that uh, I'd be interested in something rather different to that. And the way that it worked, because one of the things that kept me in Shell was this kind of professional but collegiate environment. So somehow that idea percolated through the organization. And I was then called a few months later to the office of my boss's 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 boss. I didn't even realize there was such a person. And he said, Jeremy, I hear you're interested in moving beyond the kind of early technical line. And I said, there's an opportunity I've been made aware of. It's a bit like this. And uh, I was wondering whether you were interested. If you are, I have to know before you leave the room, because I have to pick up the phone and let people know, because otherwise the job is being offered to somebody else today.
Wow.
And it was, what? Now, the value of it was, in a sense, that sounded like a big risk, because it was quite a big career step. It would have, affect my family as well as myself. But because I'd effectively been thinking about the future and imagining some different futures, it was kind of like early scenario thinking for me without me using that term. I had the sense when he described it to me that this was more like the kind of future that I envisaged than what was the standard plan. And so, with that, um, I looked quite decisive, because I said, I don't need much time to mull this over. I know you need an answer now, and I would like to do that. Please take whatever action is necessary for that. So I looked more decisive than a normal P-type person, going back to that Meyers Briggs
Yes.
discussion we had. Uh, uh, so, in one sense, that preparation, that developing of what these days I might call memories of the future, kind of was helpful. Um, do you take risks? What is a risk in a big organization more broadly than that? That was an example. Um, and I think that you know, one of the things that I found helpful is that recognizing that you work in a context where there are a whole lot of status quo biases, and um, uh, so if you are inventive with something, it can be very difficult to go along that path or to get that going. And so, there's a saying about, don't ask for permission, take action and ask for forgiveness later if that's necessary. And so I kind of followed that route. Unfortunately, I rarely had to ask for forgiveness later. So there was the scope for me to take action. So there was flexibility in the way things were, and I did things. And the way to, I think, manage that risk a bit further is to involve your superiors, your supervisors, or whatever context you're working in, at the right time. So not at the beginning where it's kind of like asking for permission. Get some things rolling and have something to show. Have something that is beginning, and then ask for their advice on it. Get their ownership and ultimately their support for it, or at least their willingness to continue to provide cover if you need that. So it's taking that. Don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness, but a bit further by saying start off and then engage others, and then you can get that ball rolling. So you are. Some people from the outside might say, "Oh, you've taken a big risk there," but you haven't. You've managed that in a particular way.
Right. And would you say taking action has been something you've always been good at, or was it something you learned over time through taking action and seeing that there weren't as many repercussions? How did you approach taking action as a concept?
Um, but perhaps again going back to that Myers Briggs, because I am a P type against your J type, um, uh, I am reflective. I think about things. I live in my head and I open possibilities up. But I don't. I know that you do have to take action, but it takes me a bit longer, I think, to push myself into that action oriented mode. And so I recognize that in myself, which is why in teams, I'd always want to make sure that there were plenty of J types in the team as well as P types like myself, and that would encourage me. Um, but also, what I've found, and that's a lesson learned, through the experience, that that there's an iterative cycle. Um, you you take action or you set a deadline, and that spurs you to do that reflective thinking within a context as well, and to broaden that as you see how that action is playing out. And so I think if I was to describe what I've learned about myself or what others have learned about me by doing all kinds of character and personality profiles on me, is that compared to the average sort of person, I'm very, very curious. Uh, but I've been able to exercise that within a context which has had a framework there. In my case, the framework was a large company, a large organization. Or when I was in doing studies, there was a frame that was there. And when I was doing theatre, there was a frame that was there. So I think that it's, for me, been helpful to find the right frame for me within which my actions can take place or be effective. Or if there isn't the right frame, help establish the right frame. So, for example, something which I think is turning out to be quite effective uh, in the world of energy and decarbonisation. Probably one of the go-to places for objective advice that the European Commission looks to is something called the Energy Transitions Commission. And I helped catalyze the formation of that. I was my department, my division was the original sponsor to get that going, and I kind of pulled the initial people together. And that created a different framework um, for objective and independent advice on decarbonisation. And since I've left Shell, I've continued to be associated with and hopefully affected in that context as well. Hope that
That's
kind of makes sense.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. And it's almost like you noticed what was the best environment for you to make progress and thrive, and so you put yourself in those frames as frequently as possible to do that,
Yeah.
which I find is very, very interesting, quite an introspective process. I don't think many people understand themselves as well as that. And so when you think of, when I think of the length of your career at one company, the first thing that comes to my mind is purpose. I think many people these days struggle to find purpose, particularly in large corporations. How are you able to find your purpose?
Do you want the long story or the short story?
The long story,
Something between.
please.
Uh, to tell the truth, uh, early in my life, it wasn't my ambition to be a business executive. In fact, I came from a bit of a background, or maybe it was also the times. When I was a rather anti-capitalist, anti-business, um, liberal in that narrow sense of a person as a background. And I mentioned, the reason that I entered a business organization was a little bit to do with the money that I was looking for to begin with. And at that time, uh, I was anticipating that I would do this for just a few years once established, whilst the experiment that I was involved with in California was, getting back up to speed, and then move back into a more academic life. And that was the idea. Um, but one particular incident changed the way I thought about this. And I was a very young guy in my early on in my second role in Shell, and I was giving a course on refinery supply economics at a former Shell refinery in Venezuela. Uh, the refinery had been nationalized in the 70s, but we were still giving uh, various services to that refinery. And whilst I was there, I'm a young guy, but at one point, this, what I thought was an elderly operator, it's probably younger than I am now, but experienced, seasoned operator, comes to seek me out as I'm walking through the refinery uh, because he wants to shake my hand. And in broken English, he's explaining to me that he wanted to make shake my hand to thank me for what Shell did in Cardon by investing in building this refinery, because before that, the way he put it, there was nothing here. It was just there were no jobs. It was miserable, and now there was a thriving community. There were houses. There were jobs, and I was taken aback. I had nothing to do with that, of course, but it was telling me something about the bigger social community value of well-placed investment. That actually, whilst not all business has that character to it, really good business has that nature to it. And I suddenly began to think about business and commercial activity in a different way, about this being about investing in things that bring benefit to others. And so that kind of had an important impact on how I thought about myself in the business context and how I thought about what business could be at its best. And I tried to encourage it to be at its best. So that was kind of one aspect of it. And then much later in my career, when I was really already quite senior in the company, and I knew a particular job was coming up, and I fitted that perfectly. I was the best candidate for the job, and so I was waiting to get asked to do the job, and I was on vacation in Massachusetts actually, and I phoned somebody up and said, "Hey, what's happening with this?" And only to find out that it had been offered to somebody else.
Wow.
And it felt like a kick in the stomach, you know. And I thought that I got beyond being driven by personal ambition, that I was old enough and I got beyond that. And yet somehow this kicked me in the stomach. And after a couple of hours of feeling almost physically ill, I thought, just a minute, you shouldn't be feeling like this, because you said you've broken personal ambition and that your ambition now was for um, to see good things happen. So think this through. And so I went out with a sketch pad or something, a notepad and a pen, and I kind of sat on a bridge and I wrote over the next few hours in the blazing sun, got blisters and all that kind of thing, my first personal mission and vision statement. And uh, I remember that the first little phrase in that was that in God's economy, who you are is more important than what you do, but that's important as well. And so it kind of started from that point. And uh, it evolved over time. I used to go back to it every year for several years until it had fully internalized. But it basically came down to how I would express my purpose now, which is, to promote a better life for people with a healthy planet. And that's a broad umbrella under which a number of things can, take shelter. But that's the process at which how this came about. And basically, the last 20 years of my life have been associated with contributing to that purpose.
Amazing. And why do you think it took that catalyst of not getting the job to create a mission statement? I mean, not many people have mission statements, but why do you think it took that as the catalyst to create your mission statement?
I think it comes down a little bit to all those status quo biases that I mentioned, and this sense that perhaps we all carry, but I was obviously carrying that. I'm basically a good person already, and so there's a certain amount of complacency within that. And uh, sometimes it can be helpful to be shocked out of complacency. And so I'm being honest with you. I hadn't appreciated I had become complacent until I got that shock.
Yeah, sometimes it does take a shock like that to change your perspective a bit. And
I don't want too many of them in my life, but that was valuable.
yes. And so we've had quite a in-depth conversation on these frameworks that you've sort of set up throughout your career. But I'd like to understand, at the end of your career, what kind of projects were you working on and what impact were you trying to have?
Hmm. Um, they're a little bit related to what had become over decades the symbol associated with my team, which was the dodo. So our purpose was to prevent the company going the way of the dodo, becoming too complacent. We used that word earlier, within its environment where it was big and successful, and not um, respond to changes in the environment or get ahead of changes that were coming. And so, uh, you know, what I have been focused on is around, if you're going to use that frame that we have popularized, energy transitions and decarbonization, and that sense of a better life for people with a healthy planet. So that sense of the importance of being able to have productive activity to build houses and roads and have jobs and the energy needed for that, but in a decarbonizing way was important. And uh, in different ways, I was privileged enough to be able to work and be at the table to help shift some of those ways of understanding the world in the company and the types of steps to take to be um, a leader in areas of those energy transitions. And my wife, uh, who's an artist, so she drew a picture of this somewhere. I don't know where it is, but she started describing me as the barnacle on the rudder of this great big liner. Uh, so I was a barnacle on the rudder, and I'd collect other barnacles together. And over time, the impact of those barnacles was shifting the rudder, and that was shifting the direction of the company. And so that was where my focus was from the company. But of course, the company is always within a context, and so you're also trying to bring uh, deeper understanding and promote action beyond the company as well. And so, as an example, the way people thought about decarbonisation and greenhouse gases and climate for a long time, because the conversation had developed at the United Nations level, was in a national type of conversation. And that's important. It is very important. But it was kind of stuck there. And then um, I, myself and my team, recognized that because end use actually drives the emissions that are made, and there are a whole variety of end use technologies which are generally in different sectors of the economy, you have to have a deep sectoral understanding that crosses the national understanding. So to work to deepen and to promote elsewhere a sectoral perspective. And you see that that has effectively now been absorbed and adopted in the way European Commission policy is framed, national policies are framed, even in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act has got a strong sectoral dimension to it as well. So that was one of those aspects that I was working on towards the latter part of my career.
Wow, tackling such fascinating big picture problems. And looking at large big picture environmental issues, what is your view on how we can make a real difference?
Now, what's the we there? Is this we as an individual citizen, we as an individual consumer, or we as being within a big organization or something like that? What's on your mind?
Um, would you be able to answer for both, if possible?
Well, I can give it a try. Okay, so um, the the national, or if you're in a different place, state type of perspective remains important uh, because uh, jurisdictions tend to be around states or regions. So that the setting of policy or the setting of regulation tends to be that way. And how do we influence that? Well, we influence that as citizens with the way that we vote and who we support in our votes and things like that. So I think that as citizens, that is one particular way. Um, as consumers, we also have an impact. And we haven't really picked that up sufficiently yet. And I'm doing some thinking about that currently. But I've learned, for example, through either work that I've done or work that others have done that I've been privileged to know about, that you know, over half of all greenhouse gas emissions emerge from just um, 8 supply chains. And these supply chains end, of course, with some kind of consumer purchase. And that consumer purchase might be a pair of jeans, or it might be a car, or it might be a fridge or a house or something like that. And if you do the calculations along the supply chains, you find, for example, that the cost of making a kind of fully sustainable pair of jeans would only add perhaps $2, €2, £2, whichever denomination you're in, to the cost of it, which is easily absorbable by many people and is small compared to the kind of fashion premium that there is. The difficulty is translating how that premium finance mechanism would work its way back up the supply chain to the places where the investment needs to be made to to do that activity. Similarly with a car, you might be paying, I don't know, 20 or 25,000 for a car, and you might be paying uh, 500 for uh, a better fabric on your seats or fancy wheel hubs. Well, 500 would decarbonize the steel and the aluminium in your car. But how would that 500, if you paid it, find its way back to the steel manufacturer and the iron ore miner? So these things have to be still connected up. But I think that a consumer awareness around these things uh, and a way to signal that as consumers, uh, you there's a sector. I know these are hard times for many people, but there's a sector of people who can afford and would be willing to afford to have that kind of sustainable product. Would be a helpful signal to the industry and help industries align along the value chains to be able to provide that. So that's just a thought and something I'm working ideas on at the moment.
And speaking of signals in another sense, do you think a lot of individuals' incentives for looking after environment have to incorporate some form of external signal, sort of for validation for looking after the environment, if that makes sense?
Uh, I think I've got your question, so I'll answer it. And if I've answered the wrong question, then come back, okay?
Sure.
But I'll give you an example. Um, Company that I was involved in um, finally managed to get out of the mindset which the industry had fallen into for a long time, that um, car fuel, vehicle fuel, was a commodity, and began to see that actually there are ways of having tailored offerings that are particularly attractive to some people. And so they developed packages of additives, one of which was a performance enhancing sort of additive, one of which was a sustainability enhancing additive, and one of which was a maintenance improving additive. And then tried these things out, and in um, in those kinds of focus groups and in surveys for people, lots of people said they were interested in the uh, uh, let's call it the green package. So experiments were done by actually putting these on forecourts, and what was found out was that even in countries which had expressed a very strong interest in the green additive, they didn't buy it. They went for the performance additive. And so, the company provides the performance additive. It actually put quite a lot of the green stuff in the performance additive as well. But so people will express a preference, but not actually express it when it comes to their purchases, because their minds are broader than just the idea of green. Um, Tesla had a big success, but it wasn't because of promoting the fact that an electric vehicle reduces emissions. It was a computer on wheels that appealed to a certain set of people willing to pay a premium for that kind of excitement that was there. So I think there's an element of being able to broaden the offering in a way that becomes visible, that is able to signal. And again, that's kind of one of the areas that I'm thinking about, is what kind of signaling could people do that would be helpful, that signals something about themselves that they care about, rather like the tech geeks with the initial Teslas. But it is part of um, your brand building in a community or in a society as well. So I think people do really care, but that care needs to be um, accessed carefully along with other things that people also really care about, and possibly, if they're honest, care more about.
Yeah, such a difficult challenge. It's not simply just coming up with green solutions, it's getting people to adopt them too. And so it's a completely different set of incentives from just solving the environmental issues.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So looking back, what would you attribute your success to?
Oh,
It's a
have I
difficult one.
been successful? I guess I've been very privileged, and had rewards from that privilege that I've had. You know, time will tell, in a sense, about whether I've been successful. If you look 20 years down the road, and we are further down the decarbonisation pathway than we might otherwise have been. If you look down the road and um, the growing population in the world have access to a decent quality of life and have the the energy, the power, the fuel to enable that, then that's some signal of the kind of success I would like to see and like to be associated with. What I attribute my success to, it's probably having developed those aspects of strategic character that I spoke about, and being able to um, develop and use those in teams and in organizations where I had the scope to do that, and enough freedom to try things. Um, and that takes um, the kindness of strangers. The play from Tennessee Williams.
Yes.
The Blanche Dubois says something about living on the kindness of strangers. I've mentioned strangers like the Australian fellow at Oxford who had a big influence on bringing me into that. I've mentioned some of the other folks who had that, and I've been in a context. I was quite young when I became part of what's called the senior executive group in the company. I think at the time I was the youngest member of the senior executive group, and the director of human relations at the time I got to know pretty well, and he confided in me that when people looked at the senior executive group, I was tolerated but not embraced. So I was allowed to be at the table and be influential, and I was eventually quite happy with that. I was shocked at first when told that, but I was eventually quite happy with it because it fitted with the kind of work that I was doing. Because I have to kind of tell as best as I can see the truth to power and have an influence of that. So you need to be at the table, but you can't become too absorbed in all those forces that are pushing towards the status quo. And so I was within an organization that was willing to tolerate me, even though they didn't fully embrace me. Perhaps that was the trick. So there was something about the privilege I had in the way that I developed and the experiences I had, um, educational experiences, the theatrical experiences, the work experiences, and uh, the kindness of strangers as well.
That's great. That's an amazing sort of tagline: tolerated but not embraced. Is there anything you're currently working on personally?
Oh, yes, I retired from corporate executive life about a year ago, and so I've got this portfolio of about a dozen things, which my wife gets not frustrated at, but she always makes a smart comment when everybody asks, "Oh, how's retirement going?" Not retired. So I'm doing a number of different things, but um, they're generally within that broad umbrella, even though some of them are within international organizations or giving some advice to companies or giving some advice to universities or whatever. In that broad promoting a better life for the healthy planet, that sense of um, what does the common good actually mean, and how do we um, promote that? How do we sustain that? So it is within that. So getting into a bit more granularity, from an energy point of view, I talked about how that national perspective on emissions needed to be supplemented with the sectoral perspective. I'd like to help really extend that further, saying in addition, you need to have that supply chain perspective, and particularly um, the recognition that there are going to be successful early movers and pioneers, and there are going to be successful or attractive early adopters, pioneer markets as well, and help get that understanding across. I think there's in the area of common good. I think there's something I came late to really appreciate, but there's one of history's huge injustices, which is the nature of the patriarchy and the oppression of women. And I learn more and more about that. And if people are interested in part of the insights I've developed on that and connecting it into that better life with a healthy planet, I've written a little article called "Want a Healthy Planet? Unleash Women," and that's something that I'm also pretty committed to trying to um, support those who can really do something about that, whether those are non-governmental organizations like Pathfinders International, who I've got an association with. And again, perhaps a really the more nerd Jeremy sort of level. Um, Part of the scenario thinking process is actually developing the different outlooks and having at the beginning of that you look for sparks and very often you're looking for thoughtful individuals from different backgrounds who will come and talk about an issue, and you'll then hear different perspectives, and you can work out, well, sometimes where those differences aren't really differences, it's a way of expressing. Sometimes the real differences, so there's a real uncertainty there, and you get that. And because it's so much in the news at the moment, and because I previously was involved in leading digitalization of society type scenarios, I'm interested in experimenting with whether you can use Chat GPT to generate some very different sparks, which are actually helpful, along with other sparks, in getting that process running, that technical process. I do distinguish between what I call craft one and craft two in that scenario exercise. Craft one is the technical side, and people see that because they see reports or presentations like that. But more significant for me is craft two, which is the social craft of bringing insights to life in the minds of others, and that's almost a psychological as well as a social craft that's there. But here's a little experiment that to see whether this can make a low-cost contribution to the sparks that help people with that technical craft.
That's fascinating, and I agree with your wife. It does not sound like you have retired. You're doing many things. That's amazing. And so the closing tradition on this podcast is to turn things around and ask you whether you have a question for me.
Oh, I see. Good. Well, it's one question, but I may have to formulate with a couple of questions so to get to the heart of it. So,
Sure.
why are you doing these podcasts? Who are you hoping to influence, and in what way are you hoping to influence the people that you're reaching?
So I'll answer all of those in parts. So firstly, the reason why I started the podcast was because I had sort of a mental barrier to starting things, which I would attribute possibly to sort of my social conditioning and the schooling system, where it was, people were in charge of the progress you make, basically. And so I've
Yeah.
sort of struggled with that. And to the point where I got frustrated with myself. And so I just decided, just start and see what happens. And the approach to the podcast is also kind of a meta one. The purpose of it is to talk to people about starting and the lessons they've learned. And so in me starting, I am learning about how people have started, if that makes sense. And so my goals for the podcast are just to get a certain amount of episodes, which at first was 21 episodes, but because that puts you in the top 1% of all podcasts ever, it's quite a simple statistic, because only 3 make it past, only 90% post 3 episodes. And then of those 10% that get past the 3 episodes, another 10% make it to 21 episodes. And that puts you in the top 1% of all podcasts. And so I thought that was quite an easy goal. It's easy to measure, and I don't need to concentrate on any other bits of data. But I loved it so much, and I've chatted to so many interesting people and learned so many different things in the short amount of time. I'm about 11 episodes in. And so I've now committed to do it for at least a year and see what comes of it. But I'm not getting my expectation. I don't have any expectations. It's purely numerical and getting 52 episodes, and then I'll make a decision from there. But I've just loved the process. And yes, the purpose is starting and hopefully inspiring other people and giving them nuggets of information on how to start, or the benefits of starting, and what people have learned from starting, and chatting to interesting people like yourself. So yes.
Oh, good. Okay, that's good, and it's very honest, and you have an interestingly measurable goal on the way. Let's say.
Yes, exactly. I don't plan on taking any other metrics on board until I reach the 52, and so the rest is just a byproduct and bonuses along the way, I suppose, if anything were to happen. So thank you for joining me today, Jeremy. I learned a lot from your stories and your frameworks. I really appreciate you taking the time. If people want to follow you on your journey, where can they do so?
Well, I'm becoming, in my old age, fairly active on LinkedIn, so they can find me on LinkedIn. I'm under Jeremy JB Bentham, and so that's LinkedIn. Some of the articles that I've published on a platform called Illuminem. If people are interested, they can track down things like the A Healthy Planet Unleash Women, or some of the work on forerunners and opportunities for forerunners in energy transition. A book has just been published that I made a contribution to, called Bringing Futures to Life. A more significant contribution was made to a book on maritime decarbonisation that is due out in the fall, in autumn this year. People are interested on where my thinking was a little while ago. There was a book that I contributed chapters to called Realistic Hope. And so people can kind of look for those kinds of things. But with the support of others, I'm hoping that I will be more active using the LinkedIn platform, so people can connect there. And I'm interested in hearing other people's perspectives and stories, and their critique of some of the things that I think. Sometimes I wonder, because I base myself in a country I love, the Netherlands. Sometimes I wonder whether people think, "What has Jeremy been smoking?" Uh, it would be highly unusual for me to have been smoking anything, but I understand that not necessarily all my thoughts and insights and ideas are going to be either whole or correct, and they will need refining and the value of the perspectives of others to help shape them.
Great. Well, thanks again, Jeremy, and speak soon. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate you making it all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the episode. One more quick reminder before you go. I have a weekly newsletter by the same name, Another Excuse, where I cover 4 topics something that has changed my perception, a tool that could be useful to you, content that is actually worth consuming, and a concept that I try break down and explain. If this sounds of any interest to you and you need a kick up the arse, then you can subscribe at the link below. Thanks for joining me again, and I'll see you next week.